Bonjour à tous, je me présente, Michael Sinatra, je suis le directeur du Centre de recherche interuniversitaire sur les humanités numériques. C'est avec grand plaisir que je vous accueille aujourd'hui pour notre conférencier Jason Farman, et je vais demander à ma collègue et membre du Centre, Juliette de Mayer, du département de communication, de vous présenter notre invité.
Hi everyone, bonjour. So it's my pleasure to introduce Jason Farman today. He's an associate professor in the Department of American Studies at the University of Maryland. And Delayed Response is his latest book, published this fall by Yale University Press. Delayed Response is about the art of waiting from the ancient to the instant world. That's the subtitle, so I didn't have to go too far to find that one. And so I read it recently, and I was reading it, and at the same time, I was reading another book about, and the other book was about high-frequency trading, the infrastructure of high-frequency trading. And those two books struck me as complementary, both about time and our obsession for speed and acceleration, and all shaped by media and communication technologies. And the book on high-frequency trading struck me, though, as different, because the delays it talks about, the waiting it talks about, is way beyond the human realm. We're talking about microseconds, nanoseconds, nothing perceptible to us. On the contrary, Jason's book is profoundly about the human experience. Waiting in his book is part of our daily lives, part of our relationships to others, part of our emotions. So it's a wonderfully written humanistic essay that reminds us that waiting does not have to be empty, that delays are not necessarily useless, and that they are part of life. So without further delay, Jason, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. I appreciate being here. Thank you for taking time to come to this talk. The project that I was recently working on, and which has been published, started as something I overheard at a conference in Boston. There was a scholar of Japanese popular culture. This was at an MIT conference several years ago. And he said in Japan, there is an emerging trend among teens, especially those who are in romantic relationships, where people would send each other a blank message. So it'd be a text message with no content. So it'd just be sort of a blip on your phone. No words, no images, no likes, no videos, just a blank message. And the romantic partner's job or responsibility as the partner was to send back a blank text message with as little time elapsed as possible. So there was no content. The content of the messages was time. How quickly someone responded, or if they were not paying adequate attention and were negligent in their romantic responsibilities, it might be several hours would pass. But the idea was, if you were paying enough attention, your phone would go off and your romantic partner would be there, and you would send back a blank text message with as little time elapsed as possible. And for me, this was something it struck me because it echoes across history what is captured in that little anecdote, that time is content, time is meaningful, time is something we interpret. As we exchange our messages asynchronously with each other, especially in the mobile media age where we turn toward mobile technologies to send each other messages and allowing us to respond whenever we get a chance, we are echoing something that has happened across time as people have sent each other messages and waited for a response. And that wait time has always not been an in-between time. Instead, the wait time itself is meaningful. It's something we interpret. And so waiting becomes content. Waiting becomes something that is a part of the message itself, not simply an in-between time between the messages. So I went to Tokyo to track down the origins of this story of the Japanese blank text, because every scholar I had talked to and every friend who was from Japan that I spoke with about the story of the blank text messages would always return a blank stare whenever I asked them about it. I've never heard of it. So I went to Tokyo and I worked with college students at several universities who would have been teens at the time when this was supposed to have taken place, and none of them had ever sent a blank text message in their life. It was apocryphal. It never happened. Which was very disappointing to me, because it was kind of the founding story of my book, was this idea of a blank message that got me going down this pathway toward writing a book. So nobody in Japan, to my knowledge, has ever sent a blank text message. It never happened. But there was, when I returned home to Maryland, which is just outside of Washington, D.C. area, a colleague of mine, I was telling him the story. I said, yeah, I just got back from Japan, and there was no blank messages. It was very disappointing. And he said, well, actually, in Italy, we did something very similar called ringing. And so for him, in the late 90s and the early 2000s, Italian teens would send each other rings. So this was prior to unlimited data plans. So any text message you sent cost money. Any phone call you made cost money. And so to maintain contact throughout a day, they would send each other rings. And this has happened in many countries across the world. Probably many places you are from, you're aware of sort of the ringing or the beeping or other kinds of things, which actually goes back well into the telephone age, when picking up and making a phone call, AT&T would charge you for that. So people would simply call and hang up. So in Italy, you would call, your caller ID would show up on the phone, and you would see that your friend or your romantic partner was ringing you, and then they would hang up after one call. No voice message, no text message, no message at all, just a ring and a hang up. And your job was to return the ring and hang up with as little time elapsed as possible. And this wait time between these was significant for these relationships. One Italian writer wrote that a ring could make or break your day, that not receiving a ring from your close friend was devastating. They did, because the person I spoke with who works at the University of Maryland who did this, there was a lot of emotional significance, and they did this for years, every single day for years and years and years throughout their high school careers. For him, he had a romantic partner who went to a different high school. They never saw each other in the hallways. So between classes, he would send a ring, and the romantic partner would return a ring. And for him, this was a meaningful time of interpretation for their romantic relationship. He described to me the burden of returning rings, that the wait times between became such an emotional, there was such emotional weight to it, that by the time he got home, he's like, I have 7 rings to return. I am feeling weighed down by this. And at one point he said, my romantic partner keeps messaging me. I'm just not interested in you enough to continue returning your rings. So he ended up breaking off the relationship because the wait times were this moment for him of analysis, of saying, I'm not interested in this relationship any longer. So this comes out of the book is called Delayed Response. And throughout the book, I trace the history of wait times as interpretation, wait times as content, and also trying to understand how wait times can be a mode of analysis for us to understand something like a romantic relationship, or to understand power dynamics, who is allowed to wait, or who is forced to wait, who is immune from waiting altogether. How can wait times be a way of understanding how a society distributes power and distributes time unevenly to people, putting them in positions of disempowerment because of how they are forced to wait in certain ways. So right now we send messages and wait for a response in emails, text messages, and people throughout history have sent messages and waited for a response, whether that be messengers running or riding on horseback, the morning edition, telegraph, or pneumatic tube mail systems. Throughout history, we have sent messages and waited for responses, and those wait times accompany a range of emotions like anxiety, fear, or hope, or longing, or potentially boredom as well, which I find to be a very interesting analytic. So these interpretations have been historically a powerful way that shapes human connection, and also the ways that we exchange knowledge with each other. Wait times are fundamental for knowledge distribution and exchange and innovation as well. So technology has radically transformed the pace of this exchange, where it feels like we are very much in a moment of the instant, and we potentially are a bit more impatient with how we are willing to wait for things. In my own life, as I have any sort of curiosity come to mind, it's deeply pleasurable to be able to take my phone out, turn on Google, and find an answer. But I was driven by the question of what happens when we as a society or cultures across the planet right now work to eliminate waiting from our lives. What do we lose if we lose wait times? I think we generally approach the topic of waiting with very negative connotations. What can come of waiting that's positive? When waiting is a barrier to something that we're after. Waiting is that in-between time, and we often feel anxious about those wait times because we have no control. We often feel disempowered when we are forced to wait. We don't know when the waiting will end, and thus we have a lot of discomfort with waiting. But waiting accompanies so many potentially positive things that the book tries to position waiting as an analytic, but also as a potential practice that develops our own sense of the temporal that connects people rather than emphasizing the individual time. Instead, thinking of time as collective as opposed to individual. So I begin with a contemporary moment in this book with the story of the blank text messages. The first chapter looks at mobile messaging in Japan, especially around the time of the Fukushima earthquake and tsunami, as people tried to reach out to their loved ones and were unable to get a hold of them. So in this culture of instant communication, what happens when the infrastructures for that disappear and you are left waiting for a response from somebody? And then I go on a bit of a media archaeological dig back through history to look at other moments of waiting and the technologies for message exchange, such as the pneumatic tube mail system, which I'll talk a little bit about today. This is Grand Central Station in New York City. The pneumatic tubes were a mail delivery system that was in many cities around the world. In the United States, it was in 5 cities, developed in the 19th century in the United States in the 1890s. And all the way up through the 1950s. The one in France was the most expansive, with hundreds of miles, and went all the way, functioned through the 1980s. So looking at how the pneumatic tube system became an icon of the instant, and developed the notion of instant messaging, of being able to drop a note in the pneumatic tubes and be able to have somebody get it within the hour, and to be able to exchange these messages all day long. E.B. White, for example, the author, it's a bit hard to read back there. He has a book called Here is New York, and he opens the book with this phrase: "It's a miracle that New York works at all. The subterranean system of telephone cables, power lines, steam pipes, gas mains, and sewer pipes is reason enough to abandon the island to the gods and weevils. Every time an incision is made in the pavement, noisy surgeons expose ganglia that are tangled beyond belief. When a young man in Manhattan writes a letter to his girl in Brooklyn, the love message gets blown to her through a pneumatic tube," just like that. So E.B. White, writing in the 1940s, is evoking the dominant cultural mythology of the instant, that I'm in love with someone who's in Brooklyn, and I just drop her a line and it gets blown to her. So I begin by looking at how the instant has these roots in the 19th century that really inform our own contemporary moment of the instant, of instantaneous connection, how that began with things like the telegraph or the pneumatic tube system. I go on to look at things like space exploration and communication with deep space, how knowledge exchange is often predicated on very long moments of waiting. I'm a digital media scholar, and I went and interviewed the team that created the New Horizons mission that did the flyby to Pluto. They're in Maryland. They're about 15 minutes from my house, and I got to spend time interviewing them and working with them, and to hear about the process of this. After New Horizons did its closest flyby to Pluto, the spacecraft turned and beamed its data back to Earth, and it took 16 months for all of that data to accumulate here. And that was after 9 years of journeying. That was after maybe another decade of planning and preparation and funding and building the spacecraft. So when all is said and done, you have from the late 1980s all the way until the flyby in 2015 and the final trickles of data arriving to Earth 16 months later. And then the scientists get to start their work. For me as a digital media scholar, waiting decades, not only decades, waiting just 16 months to get my data is staggering. And for me, that was what drew me to this as an object of study. When something requires and has built into it delays that are required for you to get access to your knowledge, that was very interesting for me, and I wanted to dig into that and began thinking about how, when it comes to the unknown, we often send explorers out to report back to us the things that we don't know and we don't see. And delays are also built into the very nature of how our brains function when it comes to knowledge. Wait times are essential for something to move from short-term memory to long-term memory. For the actual cognitive processes, for the proteins to move something from short-term memory to long-term memory requires delay, which is why, for example, we encourage our students to not cram for an exam the night before. Because if you don't introduce delays into your study or into your research, it doesn't move into long-term memory. It just stays in either the short-term memory or the working memory and does not move on to long-term memory, which is why when I do a Google search on my phone, it's pleasurable, but I will likely forget it the next day. Because innovating on knowledge and storing it and doing something interesting with it has delay built into it. Knowledge requires time. I go back to letter writing in the US Civil War, looking at how, for the first time in the United States, people were writing letters and expecting a response. Starting in 1847, the United States Postal Service introduced stamps, which prior to this, when you would send a letter, I would write your name on it. I would give it to the postal worker who would then deliver it to you, and you were responsible for the payment of that journey for that letter. As soon as inexpensive and standardized postage was introduced, the everyday person could write a letter about anything, rather than just like, we're getting married or somebody died. Instead, it's the everyday begins to inhabit these letters. And as soldiers in the 1800s begin moving around the country in mass by the millions, you have people writing letters at a scale that was unprecedented at this time. And you also had built into that new infrastructures for delivery. You had people sorting on the rail cars as it was moving from Virginia to Michigan. So the speed of transmission was also increased. So letter writing became a two-way process. Prior to this, it was there was such a expense and also a delay associated with it that there was no reciprocity necessarily expected within these letters. So I look at how letter writing and the actual infrastructures that provided the pathways for these letters created a particular rhythm of life. And to study that rhythm and how that shaped who these people were and how they connected with people who were far away from them, and how, again, these mirror the contemporary moment. In the United States, most of the internet infrastructure that exists is piggybacking on Civil War railroads. So if you go and trace out the fiber optic cables within the United States, in many parts of the country, they're following pathways of the railroads that were laid during the Civil War. So same infrastructure for letter delivery as it is for our own fiber optic age. I look at medieval seals as well. I'm very interested in embodiment and how the body gets communicated at a distance, especially with all of the media I look at are asynchronous. And so how do you connect in an embodied way with someone at a distance? How do you mark your body on a document as evidence of who you are in an age where that's uncertain? So I look at the practice of sealing and impressing your body onto a document as evidence of that body, and to send who you are out into the world as a way of communicating who you are and also for those in power, who were many of the people who owned seals, a decree to not wait, to not delay in either doing what's in the letter or responding to the letter. For example, an example that I came across that I really enjoyed was looking at King Henry VIII gathering a group of archbishops and powerful people together, and he wants a divorce from Catherine of Aragon. And so he gets these people to write a letter asking the Pope for dispensation of please dissolve this marriage. And they all affix their seals to the bottom as evidence of their power. And they send it to the Pope. There's about 80 of these seals just lining the bottom of the document. This is at the Vatican right now. It's this huge document with 80 seals at the bottom. Imagine being the Pope getting this document with all of like the embodied power of these men marked to the bottom of it. The Pope decides to wait. He decides to delay his response to Henry VIII as a way of saying, I'm actually the one in power here, and you will wait for my response. And then Henry VIII says, I'm too powerful to wait for you. I won't wait any longer. So then he dissolves the relationship between England and the church and installs himself as the head of the Church of England. All of this around the communication of power through letters, but also the communication of power through the act of delaying, the act of making another person wait, and how some people feel too powerful to wait any longer. So I go back and I conclude with the first messages that humans ever sent to each other. This is Aboriginal message sticks in Australia, which were about 12,000 years ago, but as far back potentially as 40 to 55,000 years ago, as humans began migrating onto the continent of Australia, they used a sophisticated communication system for sharing knowledge and gathering tribes together, especially exchanging knowledge about the harsh landscape. In order to move across this continent, you had to have a system of knowledge exchange. So people knew how to navigate the land. And this was done through message sticks, which were essentially these runner's batons. This was one that's preserved in a museum that I saw. And on them, you would have somebody dictate a message, which then became pictographs on the wooden baton. That was then handed to the fastest runner in the tribe, who would then move across the land and deliver it to the next tribe over through oral message with the stick as evidence, sometimes having hair of the leader attached to it as embodied proof that that person was sending the message. And these messages were the act of sending a message was so sacred and powerful that anyone holding one of these sticks was immune from any hostile interaction. They could not be touched. So I think of it as a bit like net neutrality. The message could not be impeded in any kind of way, because messages were so vital to the culture and to the movement across the land that they were untouchable. So it begins with text messages, and then it goes back to the dawn of human communication exchange. So it's kind of a narrow scope of human history of 55,000 years or so. So one of the things I wanted to dig into a little bit today was looking at the parallel between the internet age and the pneumatic tube system. Half a century before the pneumatic tubes, or half a century after the pneumatic tubes were laid in New York City, there was a tech entrepreneur named Randolph Stark who was walking home from a tech meetup that day. He was in his 20s, and this was at the height of the dot-com boom, when everything was being funded and there was such promise in the early days of the internet. And he was at a technology meetup where someone had told him that New York City used to have miles of pneumatic tubes laid underneath it to send messages between post office stations. And as he was walking home in his Wall Street neighborhood, he saw a crew of workers digging a trench to lay fiber optic cables between the bank and the stock exchange in New York City. And he thought to himself, this is a really unnecessary expense, because if you're laying fiber optics, the infrastructure is actually right there, just a few feet beneath where you guys are digging. So he came up with this business venture to lay fiber optic cables within the old pneumatic tube infrastructure. And at this time, you had the rise of DSL. So essentially, you moved from modem dial-up to instead having a dedicated service line, which meant you could be connected to the internet all day long. The problem with DSL was the further you got from the servers, your internet degraded. And it was unusable if it was about 3 miles away from the servers. So this was a solution to that. Run fiber optic cable through the old pneumatic tubes and then use these old hubs as server sites. And essentially then distribute them out over the last mile to apartments and office buildings, makes things faster, because speed was the most expensive thing at the time. So he imagined recuperating the old pneumatic tube system in order to figure out a way to get people connected in faster ways to the internet. But he had no idea who actually owned the pneumatic tubes. They were just sitting there under the city streets. So he went into the archives at the New York Public Library and then also at the archives in Washington, D.C. And they had pulled out these old archival boxes with this technology from the late 19th century. And he said, this is a very odd juxtaposition to be researching the technology of the future by looking at something that was built in the 1890s. But the similarities were profound, actually. You know, the mysticism, again, of the instant was so appealing both in the .com era, but also in the era of the pneumatic tube. So in 1897, 27 miles of tube were laid in New York City, where they would shoot these canisters, they're called carriers, they were brass. And this one, for example, could fit about 600 letters in it. And they would travel at about 30 miles an hour under the city streets, between post office stations. And prior to this, obviously popular across Europe, but in the US, they were in 5 different cities. And they would leave the post offices every 10 minutes. And you could get a letter within an hour, and it ran all day long. And so there are moments like the .com era, but also moments like the pneumatic era, where the technology has sped up to a place that is unprecedented for the time and really gets you to think in different ways about connecting in instant kinds of ways. So it seemed to eliminate waiting altogether. And I think we can identify moments in the mobile media age as well, where the technology seems to eliminate waiting, where you get next day delivery, or you can find someone to fall in love with or have sex with that night on your phone. You know, the elimination of waiting altogether right there in your pocket allows a connection that is unprecedented. And I think the seeds of that enchantment were planted in this period and have really shaped who we are. And one of the things to keep in mind is these tubes, like you can kind of see the tubes that were in the post office and running underground. These existed alongside the dominant mail delivery system of the time, which is a horse and wagon. So you have this pneumatic system next to this, and it feels like people are living in the future. And this, again, has found its way into science fiction novels like E.M. Forrester's Machine Stops. The pneumatic system in that book delivers all of your needs right to your home. And this was the idea ultimately too. The postmaster generals across the ages that this existed were like, this is going to be in every person's home. You're going to have your own personal container. It's going to connect to me, and we're just going to be able to exchange things all day long right into our homes. And that was sort of the sci-fi fantasy that made its way into books like Machine Stops, where everything comes through the tubes, all of your needs. So this is the juxtaposition that's happening at this time. The pneumatic tubes were placed underground, and that accomplished 2 different things. In part, it allowed the system to function regardless of what was happening above. So a huge snowstorm impedes delivery, but with the pneumatic tubes, it didn't change anything. They were all underground. They consistently delivered messages at the same exact speed because they were They didn't have to worry about traffic. They didn't have to worry about snow. But the second component of the underground placement allowed there to be a mysticism around what this system was able to actually accomplish. And that mysticism was very powerful in shaping public perception of communication and the possibilities of communication. And those were the everyday person's understanding of the pneumatic tube system was largely detached from the physical realities of it and how it actually functioned. And I think many of us in this room have either now or in the past have a very similar relationship to the internet. It brings us the things that we want, but we don't know how it works. And this was highlighted in a cartoon from 1915 that was in a newspaper where it shows a clunky mail car. So cars were delivered and cars could deliver the mail, but it's stuck at a bridge crossing. So the bridge opens to let the boat through. In contrast is the pneumatic tube. It says what we have, what we ought to have. And it says US mail, and it's shaped like a missile. So it's militaristic, it's fast, it launches itself. And here's this guy waiting at the bridge for the boat to pass. And so there's this notion that kind of circulates among the popular imaginary around the speed of delivery, and speed always being better than slowness. And it's so embedded. It's been interesting publishing this book about waiting and seeing how people respond to it. It takes a lot to get people past the notion that waiting is bad. Delays are constantly bad. There is no benefit to delay. Why would I want to delay anything? If I can get it faster, there's always a benefit to that. And so this is trying to flip some of that on its head and to try to recuperate waiting as a potential benefit, rather than simply understanding the speed of delivery as always something that is a positive benefit toward, the wait times are understood as a barrier between people, between the things that we desire. So one of the things that the hidden nature of the infrastructure supports is, especially in communication, is the notion that communication is about sharing ideas that should not be impeded or altered based on the medium of exchange. That the medium should never matter, that what we're after is the content, and if we can get the content faster, that's always better, rather than understanding that the medium itself actually shapes the nature of communication, which is what I'm arguing here, is that the speed itself is embedded into the meaning of the content. We have historically removed content and media, but the speed of the media is actually a part of the message itself. So it's not in Edward T. Hall's example, or sorry, in E.M. Forrester's example of the lovers in Manhattan and Brooklyn exchanging messages. It's not that they just exchanged messages, it's that they exchanged messages through pneumatic tube. That the pneumatic tube was actually an important component of that. That it's a letter delivered with a certain speed through a particular medium, which has a certain mode of communication. So part of this links with Edward T. Hall's work in chronemics. So Edward T. Hall, anthropologist who established ideas of proxemics and understanding how closeness can be interpreted culturally, as we have different notions of physical, personal, private space, also worked to establish chronemics, the social study of time and how people understand time differently. So he wrote a book called Silent Language, and it opens with this quote: "Time talks. It speaks more plainly than words. The messages it conveys comes through loud and clear. Because it is manipulated less consciously, it is subject to less distortion than the spoken language. It can shout truth where words lie." And we can find very simple examples of that. If your partner comes out for an evening, you're heading out together, and they say, "How do I look?" And you go, "Good." That pause is like, "Oh, I guess I've got to go change." So the partner said, "You look good," but the partner didn't mean you look good. So the pause, the delay is interpreted, right? "How do I look?" "Good." So the gestures, the intonation, are all part of nonverbal communication, right? Time is embedded within nonverbal communication. So as communication studies scholars study gesture and facial expression, you know, as somebody is saying something positive, but they're shaking their head no, you interpret that. Or they have a scowl and say, oh yeah, you look good. You tend to interpret the face rather than the words. So humans give a lot of weight to nonverbal communication, and we often give it dominance, actually. So if the words are saying one thing, but the person's scrunching their face, you trust their face rather than the words that are coming out of their mouth. And time is similar. And time is just this very fascinating subject for me to study, especially with things like romantic relationships, with the construction of gender and time. You have sort of old stereotypes of, I met someone at the bar, how long should I wait until I message them? I can't message them right away. That's going to look too eager. And you go back to 19th century literature with women's ability to wait as being the performance of gender, right? I will wait until he calls on me. And that patience and that pause and willingness to wait embodies a particular gender stereotype of a moment. So time is something that communicates. And what's interesting about the way time communicates is that it always communicates. So you can decide to speak or not speak, or send a message or not send a message through words or texts, images, videos. But when it comes to time, it's always communicating. So someone sends you a text message, and there's a new term that has kind of emerged called being left on read, which is when a text message arrives and you see that it's been read, and then the person doesn't respond. And you can kind of look on Twitter, actually. It's just fascinating to search left on read and READ, left on read. And people are so emotionally impacted by somebody reading your message and deciding not to respond to you, especially on a mobile device that they have on them all day long, and you didn't respond to me. It's this deep emotional impact. We've done a study of university students across North America and their wait times for text messaging, and the emotional toll that accompanies a non-response is really significant. People take this deeply because time communicates. So it's not that the person didn't send words, it's that they're communicating their lack of response. That is a communication. It means something, it's interpreted, especially when they have their device on them at all times. So along these lines, there's a lot of the book also focuses on the feedback mechanisms that are letting people know about wait times, whether it be buffering or % done progress bars as a way of keeping people around a little bit longer to hold their attention, or the delivered and read marks. In Japan, the popular app is called Line, and Line was produced after the Tohoku earthquake that caused the Fukushima meltdown. And so the application requires that all users get a little red mark. You can't turn it off like you can with iMessage. So in other words, if you send a message, you will always know when somebody has read it. And this was part of their design. They said, this is communication. This is important to us. If all the other person sees is that they read it, that's communication. That's good enough for us. We want to be able to communicate that. And so what has emerged in Japan are these ideas of what's called kiroku through and miroku through. So has the message been read yet or read through yet, or has the message not been read through yet? And there are entire social structures that have emerged around whether or not it's been read or not. And the patience people have, if the message has not yet been read, is significant. People are willing to wait. As soon as it's marked as read, there is a cultural expectation of a timely response. And if that's not given, then socially it's seen as very negative. So these are, I think as a mobile media scholar, my first book was about mobile technology. And I looked at space and place and the production of space through mobile media as we take our technologies out with us and they shape our relationships to space, and we can shape our spaces through these technologies. One of the things that interested me was that since 2009, globally, we have been using our mobile devices more for message exchange and data exchange than for voice communication. And that's been true since 2009. We're texting and emailing more, and we're talking less. So why do we choose a platform that makes us wait? Why do we decide to send a text message when it requires that actually it has built into its very fabric waiting? You can just pick up the phone and talk to the person if they're available. Instead, we text and then we wait. And that is part of the ways that phones have moved into everyday life, that you're no longer calling to places, you're calling to people, and you don't know what context your message might or your call might be entering. So you're not certain about the social context that a call might interrupt. And so we imagine that text messaging is more socially appropriate. In Tokyo, it's very frowned upon to use voice communication on the metro. To talk on the subway you just cannot do it. So people text each other, and they have these very long commutes from home to university, hour and a half long on the subway. And so they text each other all day long. They're in conversations. And it also has this feeling of connection. They have 6 conversations, 10 conversations happening simultaneously through the platforms. And what's really interesting alongside this is the everyday use of these mobile devices. We tend to unlock our phones on average 150 times in a day. And if you are under 34 years of age, you're touching, swiping, tapping your phone 2,600 times in a day. And the students that we surveyed, both in Canada and the US, on average, they expect a response to a text message in about 5 minutes. So all of this together makes sense. You know, when you think about it, you're using your phone how often? You're looking at it how often? That means when I send you a text message, you're probably going to see it in 5 minutes unless you're in this room right now and you're going to have to wait till you leave. You know, you're in a meeting, you're in class, and it's maybe socially inappropriate to be texting or something. I don't mind, but you can do that. But like, you know, in other contexts, you may not be able to do that. But on average, you're unlocking your phone so often and you're touching it so much throughout the day that you've probably read the message in 5 to 7 minutes. And if you haven't responded, then there's an emotional toll to that. It's communicating something to people. So waiting is built into our lives as mobile media users. And that's where I began with this and began to think, well, how is that similar in these moments throughout history? And as I think about our choice to use mobile technologies and mobile media like text messaging, I just connect with this notion of waiting that is so, we just hate it. We absolutely hate waiting. And we, meaning many Western cultures. In other cultures, waiting is actually built into how community is established. One of my colleagues studies Uganda, and for her, waiting at the bus stop is how the community reiterates itself. So everyone gets together about an hour before the bus arrives at the bus stop, and they wait together. And that's where you see each other face to face. That's where you connect and catch up, is in the moment of waiting for the bus to get there. And it's never thought about as this negative in-between time. It's actually the time that reiterates community. But most Western cultures have negative connotations built into the notion of waiting. And again, because often we imagine it as a barrier, we imagine it as powerlessness, as something we can't control. Waiting, as opposed to stillness, is often forced upon us when maybe if you're meditating and taking a pause, that is it. You have agency over that. You are an active agent in your use of time. I decide to be still in the morning. I'm going to sit with my coffee. I'm going to think. I'm going to pause and, regenerate. Waiting, on the other hand, is I'll be right with you, or the next customer service representative will be on the line momentarily. And you listen, and you're online. Talking, waiting for the airport, or the airline company to get on the line so you can talk about that flight you had to cancel. The average wait time will be 45 minutes, and you just put it on speakerphone and you can move on with your life. But you have very little control the United States, we just had a federal shutdown of the government where federal employees waited several weeks, over a month, before they got paid. So they were waiting and they had no control over stopping that wait time. So waiting is something that we feel powerless and frustrated about. And tech companies are actually seizing on these desires. So if you're like me and you have a moment of pause, your first impulse might be to pull out a mobile device. The other day, I was walking through my building at the University of Maryland, and every single student I passed who was waiting in a hallway was on a phone. So the avoidance techniques of waiting are profound, and tech companies are seizing on them. So for technology companies, waiting is simultaneously something that needs to be eliminated. Let's get rid of delays. Let's get rid of latency. And it's also an opportunity. Oh, you'd hate waiting. Come use our product. So it's simultaneously both of those things. And the avoidance techniques are, companies are very committed to both eliminating the negative effects of waiting and then also seizing on it. Amazon did a study where it found that a 1/10 of a second delay that customers on average are forced to wait on their site, they could lose 1% of their revenue. And a 1/10 of a second, to put that in perspective, is about the time it takes for a sensation to go from a nerve ending to your brain. So it's it's beyond the realm of human perception, but it is affective. It's something we can still have a sense of. And similarly, Google, if you do a Google search right now, you'll get 10 results on your page. And people were like, why don't you give us more? Give us 30 results. So they experimented with a small group of users, giving them 30 results instead of 10. The search results were a half-second difference. And the overall drop in Google traffic was 20%. So half-second delay, because it took a little bit longer for the Google search results to come, led to a 20% reduction in traffic. So we set expectations cognitively. When we encounter a technology, that is when we set a moment of cognitive expectation for how long things should take. And when they deviate from that, even at the realm of a 1/10 of a second, we feel something that leads us to move on. So these companies are tapping into that between these in-between times and trying to get us to think about waiting as something that needs to be eliminated and something that can be seized upon within our lives. So within the book, I advocate at the end, in the last chapter, for us to become students of waiting and to develop tactics of waiting, kind of drawing on Michel Deschateau and this notion of tactics. That tactics can be a way of resistance, a way of understanding strategies as the things that are imposed upon you. How do you deal with those strategies? You deal with them through tactics. So to end, I'm going to give you a couple of tactics of waiting in your everyday lives. How should you deal with waiting? First part is to ask a very simple question: is why are you waiting? We are so emotionally reactive to waiting that I think it masks the deeper political impact of waiting. It gets us to feel certain things that actually veil why waiting is actually happening and why we feel certain things about waiting. So I usually ask people to follow that up with the question, who benefits from me waiting? And this has been a very powerful question for me. Who benefits from me waiting? And you can sometimes identify yourself as a beneficiary of waiting if you are developing patience, if you are accruing money in a retirement account rather than taking it out right away. We have many cultural notions that are valorous when it comes to waiting and how you might benefit from your own waiting. But often other people are benefiting from you waiting. And that is emphasizing the power dynamics maybe in your relationship. Is your partner making you wait? Are you making your partner wait? Often that is a claim toward priority of time. That is creating a power dynamic in the relationship. Or it might be federal employees who are being forced to wait because Donald Trump wants to stake his own claim over power, right? Forcing others to wait as a way of emphasizing that. And so we can see this in waiting rooms, for example. There have been studies that I talk about in the book in welfare offices, often are designed to make people wait uncomfortably. So you can think about the design of waiting. that there are not enough seats, that there is no feedback system here. So people arrive and they're not quite sure how long they have to wait if they're going to get what they came for. And what it does is emphasize the power dynamic between the very poor in a society and the government bureaucracy that maintains that dichotomy between empowerment and disempowerment. And we can imagine, you know, in romantic relationships, if you are interested in waiting and romantic relationships, Roland Barthes' book, A Lover's Discourse, is such a good read. It's beautiful. And in that book, he says, am I in love? Yes, since I am waiting. The other never waits. Sometimes I want to play the part of the one who doesn't wait. I try to busy myself elsewhere to arrive late, but I always lose at this game. Whatever I do, I find myself there with nothing to do, punctual, even ahead of time. The lover's fatal identity is precisely, I am the one who waits. So again, the power dynamics that emerge from this. And the interesting thing along these lines as well is thinking about how we can move from understanding our time as being individual to instead being collective. And I end the book with a discussion of waiting in line at the grocery store. I was standing behind a well-dressed woman who was obviously affluent, and then there were several people behind me. I was third in line. There was a young mother with her toddler in the cart that was checking out. And she had lots of coupons, and she was paying part with cash, and she was paying part with subsidies through welfare, through food stamps. And she was making sure every coupon got counted, that everything was checked. She had to have the manager come over to make sure a certain deal was applied. And the woman in front of me turns around and just like gives me a look like, can you believe we're waiting for this woman? It's a Saturday morning. She's, you know, betraying the social contract of not making others wait. And then the people behind me are getting frustrated. And what emerged for me was how different our times were. That this woman was making us wait, and thus they were robbing these people. She was, in their eyes, she was robbing them of their most sacred resource of time. Because my time is different from your time. If you take my time, you're stealing my most valuable resource. And to flip that on its head is to imagine, how is time potentially collective? How can we then imagine our time as being interwoven? How can we identify time as something that is a part of the investment in the social fabric? If I perceive my wait times behind this woman as an investment in her circumstances, I can see that time for me is divvied out to me in ways that are very different for her. She has to use her time in ways that's so different from the ways I have to use my time. And if I see wait times as an investment, I can see that as building radical empathy, but also imagining ways that I can invest myself in her social circumstance to try to create change. To say that time has not been equal to her, why? Who benefits from her waiting, and how do we then imagine developing things differently? Sarah Sharma has a great book called In the Meantime, where she looks at laborers and how they use their time. And she calls this temporal awareness of how our time is potentially intertwined, all toward the strategy of thinking about collective time. In the United States, in Puerto Rico, after the hurricane came through, Puerto Rico was without power for months. Why? Why are they waiting? In New Orleans, after the Hurricane Katrina, they're waiting for subsidies to rebuild their houses. Why are they waiting? So waiting can be this moment of investment in the social fabric and to imagine social change as an investment into the ways that we need to change. And finally, thinking of wait times as revealing a little bit about what you hope for the future. So as you're looking at your social media feed and you're hitting refresh, what do you hope comes on the other side of that waiting? As you're on Tinder and you swipe through and it buffers, who do you hope is on the other side? Waiting can be an analytic for imagining a future that doesn't yet exist, and your hopes for the future, to think about how potentially we're half in love with the buffering icon because it has promise to it, right? We're irritated by it, but at the same time, what might come on the other side of this is it doesn't load to anything, by the way. It's just a buffering icon. It will just sit there indefinitely. But in other instances where this is going to lead to something, what do you hope it leads to? For me, it's such a rich moment of analysis. What do I hope comes on the other side of this buffering? And can I imagine ways of trying to make that future, or at least imagining different possibilities, and then thinking about how we ultimately can design these into our systems. This is a picture from Marina Abramovic's Goldberg variations, where she worked with pianist Igor Levit. And if you went to this performance, this one was at the New York Park Armory, you had to give over your phone and your watch and any sort of technologies. You put them in a locker and you were given noise-canceling headphones. And you had to sit in a deck chair for 30 minutes in silence before the performance began. For Marina Abramovic, she said, waiting is essential to understand Igor Levit's performance of the Goldberg variations on the piano. You can't walk in off of the streets of New York City and go listen to Igor Levit. She said, no, you need wait times. In order to position yourself and create a perspective that allows you to understand the performance, waiting needs to be built into it. And so designers are imagining ways of actually building these right into our technologies as a way of producing kind of an antidote for our sped up lives, trying to instill a bit of waiting and pauses to imagine ways that we can encounter the world differently through waiting, and through imagining ways that the tactics of waiting might actually provide for us a new perspective on time and how we use that time and how we perceive it. So thank you very much.
On peut ouvrir aux questions, so questions.
First question. Yes.
As Michael promised, I should do ask the first question. Thank you very much. It was really amazing. First of all, I want to confirm in Italy we do
squealy. Yes, exactly.
But I wanted to tell you that when I was in my 20s, I did also blank message.
Yes. Oh, okay. With texting.
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, it's true. Yeah.
So in Italy.
Oh, that's great. Okay.
And it was kind of okay. Yeah. I text you and
you text me back.
She should text me back as soon as she could. So
that's great.
It existed. Okay. I don't know if it was a trend or if we were alone to do this, but it existed. But anyway. I think something which seems to me very interesting, perhaps because I am Italian, is this relationship between power and waiting.
Yeah.
I mean, you have it in a very explicit way in Italy, especially a little less probably here, but the fact that if you are more important than the other person, you have to arrive late.
Yes, right.
And you
exactly.
have to be sure that the other person waits for you, because if you arrive the first, it means that you are abandoning your position. So a professor, that was something which impressed me when I first arrived teaching here. In Italy, professor entering the classroom the last. So students are there, and then professor arrives, and everybody stand up, and we do that till now. I mean, it exists. So waiting is a way of structuring relationships.
Yes, exactly.
I think I was thinking about is actually is a way of using time in order to create presence.
Yep.
I have a student who made a PhD thesis about the 3 dots.
Yes.
And actually, what he says is that the 3 dots are the possibility of being there together.
Yes.
We are there together.
Yep.
So the protocol of you have a time protocol which allows to create a common space.
Yes.
We are together because we have a time protocol.
Yep.
So waiting is a way of constructing how you structure waiting is how you structure not only time but also space.
Yes, exactly.
So that's it's consideration more than a question, but
no, I think that's great.
No matter what the ideology is,
I
mean, if it is important to if we wait or if it is fast. Because fast doesn't mean anything.
Exactly.
We always have to wait. Wait a lot, or wait nanoseconds, or wait minutes, hours, days. If you love me, you will wait a year, 2 years, 3 years. No matter. But the point in which I feel when you were talking is that we use waiting as a way of structuring time, and structuring time is a way of structuring the space we inhabit together.
Yep, absolutely. So I did come out of this as a cultural geographer in a sense. You know, the previous book was all about the cultural geography of mobile telephones. And I actually see, even though this book is about time, it is equally about space. It's about the time it takes for messages to arrive and travel across space, how people connect across spaces, and also structure their intimate spaces, even if they are immediate with one another, and to try to intervene in the cultural notions that sending messages through technologies creates a false intimacy, you know, that people feel it's less real, less intimate, less meaningful than the face-to-face conversations, when waiting, like you said, is built into everything we do. Waiting and pauses are essential for face-to-face communications, for these, and we see how these nonverbal cues get adapted across the media, whether the media be my body talking right now and using delays as so, you know, I'm conscious that, you know, many of you are perhaps French speakers initially, you know, first language being French. And so I was like, I hope I don't speak too fast because it's hard to understand somebody who's talking very fast in perhaps another language. So pauses are really important. If you eliminate those pauses, you don't understand. And that's face-to-face communication through the medium of my body. And we take those moments of pause that allow meaning to happen, and we translate them as nonverbal cues in all of the media we do. We take those same structures. Time is a way of structuring the spaces of communication and intimacy. Absolutely. So I think that the creation and structuring the production of space is very much aligned with this kind of work, because these pauses are about structures, whether it be in the romantic side of things or in the power dynamics of a professor in the classroom, and who gets to be early or late, and who gets to be immune from, I'll be going to the airport shortly, and someone will arrive far later than I am and get to walk straight to the front of the line because they have TSA pre, or, you know, they've paid for it, and they have the status to be able to just cut in line and go right through. And power and status are shaped through time. Absolutely. So all of those things converge, I think, in this, which is interestingly part of why the book is, in the book, I talk about all of my travels. You know, I traveled to Australia and interviewed the Wurundjeri tribe about their use of message sticks. I traveled to the British Archives. I traveled to Civil War battlefields, and I describe these spaces because I do see the structuring of space and the structuring of time as being inseparable, actually. So it's a bit of a travelogue, actually. It's a book about my travels and understanding time through these spaces. Yeah, it's a great observation. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm also interested in the relationship between not just time as power, but as a construct, the idea of it being a resource. Both
yes,
an individual resource,
yep.
And as you said, a collective resource, therefore something that is shared.
Yeah.
Not just shared in space, but shared in quantity as
right.
well.
Yes.
How much of my time do I give?
Exactly.
How much time do you share? And I was wondering about then the idea somewhere between power and a kind of this wasted and non-agency time, and the idea of hope.
Yeah.
If there isn't something in what you say of a currency, like currency of time, because is a wait the same as a pause, and is a pause the same as a delay?
Right.
And do we not sometimes actually give value to
yes,
delay.
Right. Yes.
Whether it is in that, because if I ask you if I look good and you say you do, I'll say you didn't look.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's the flip side to
yes,
that.
That's right.
And if your New Horizons team
Yeah.
gets their results and publishes them right away, we'll say, well, there was no analysis.
Exactly. Yes.
Because analysis requires time.
Yep.
So in the continuum, there's got to still be, even though maybe we don't always acknowledge it, because when we lose the agency, it blinds us. Yes. But isn't there a value that we do give to certain delays? And
yes. Yes, absolutely. There was a Facebook has an interesting story along these lines, which is kind of a roundabout way to answer your question, but they introduced, this was in 2016, a security scan for your profile. And it popped up and said, would you like us to scan for your security settings to, you know, make your profile more robust, more strong? And the code for doing that scan was very lean and quick. And when users clicked on it to do the scan, it basically spit back the results immediately. And what Facebook found was that nobody was changing their settings after getting this. And part of it was because it was too fast. They didn't trust it. So we have sort of this embodied expectation about how time functions as kind of a generic term. Thoroughness dictates time, right? Like the publishing example for New Horizons team. And so what Facebook decided to do was to build in a bit of latency into their code. So it scanned your Facebook profile, and then the code told it to stop and wait, and then give you the results. And then people started changing their settings like crazy because they believed it was thorough. So part of it is about cognitive and social expectations about how time is used and how time communicates thoroughness, attentiveness. If you hire a housekeeper and she comes in and cleans, okay, I'm done. It's 2 minutes. You were only there for 2, time is care, right? And then you potentially, if you're not investing that amount of time, it communicates a lack of care, a lack of attention or thoroughness. So context throughout the book matters. Time means different things in different circumstances. On the productivity side, in terms of time being a currency, this I think is quite powerful actually to think about the moral imperative to use your time wisely. So you have all decided to come and spend this time in this room, and you hope that you're using your time wisely. And you hope that it is an investment, in a sense, that you are using your time wisely. And I imagine, after looking at the landscape of ideas of productivity, that the moral imperative for using our time wisely is often accompanying the emotional toll of being busy. We feel overburdened by this notion of using time wisely and well, and that every moment needs to be used, actually. So my 35 undergraduates in a class that I had a couple of years back, I asked them to chart their week, actually, down to the minute. What did you do that week? And what was interesting that resulted from how they decided to report on it was that they had something they did all day long. There was no downtime. There was no time where they weren't doing something. And this, I think, is part of the impulse when you're in line to get your coffee and you pull out your phone and you check your email, is that time standing in line behind people needs to be utilized for productivity. And we imagine that using all of our currency of time toward valorous ends is how we become good citizens, when actually I think the opposite is true. I think actually we feel so burdened by the overuse of time rather than inserting these delays and pauses, which could potentially use that currency in very different ways.
I just wanted to bounce back on the fact that when you think about it in terms of our value as people who are part of productivity, we are also measured in time, hourly rates.
Yes, right, exactly.
Whether you're a good employee or a bad employee, if you have that same job, you have an hourly value.
Yes, exactly.
So in that sense, it really is intertwined with the currency that is money.
Yep, absolutely.
And all of us here have the types of jobs where we think we are not an hourly rate type of people, but in fact, they are buying our time.
That's right. And if you go back through the technologies of timekeeping for labor, you see as time gets divided more precisely and synchronized more accurately across history, that radically transforms what it means to be a worker. Whether that be the punch card or the fact that all of us in this room at this moment are on the same exact clock. If you have a cell phone on you that is connected, is basically distributed from the atomic clocks in Washington, D.C. that get distributed out through the Air Force through GPS to cell phone towers. We're all synchronized. So we are all coordinated around the same clock, and it radically changes what it means to work and what it means to use your time in very precise kinds of ways. Another book that has just come out along these lines is Melissa Gregg has a book out now called Counterproductive that deals with those issues of time and busyness and the worker. Really interesting.
I actually just recently read The Machine Stops.
Oh, nice.
Story by
Yes.
Ian Forster. Yeah, I love that you mentioned that. You should all read it.
Yes, it's very good.
I have a question about the way that your book relates past to present communication technologies and media. So you mentioned that different technologies through history have circulated power in part through how they control weighting or impose delays. Can you elaborate on, or maybe just give one example of how one of these historical technologies and the way that they circulate power in that manner, what that tells us about, or helps us give context to contemporary communication practices?
Yeah, so I think that that's part of the book's project as a whole, is to situate historical media alongside what we're doing. So if you look at, let me pull up the image again, if I can scroll over to it. So one of the interesting things about medieval seals are, when it came to private correspondence, there was what emerged, very early days of medieval seals was a letter close, which was a private letter. It was a document that was sealed shut, meant to be private correspondence. Otherwise, letters weren't. They were just documents kind of handed around. Anybody could read them as they were delivering them. But a letter close was sealed shut. And so the very early days of seals had a function as adhesive, which shifted not too long after they were first introduced. You had the kings who said, every time somebody opens my letter, they're going to break my seal. That's not appropriate. I'm going to instead, cut the bottom of the parchment and dangle a little bit, a string of parchment, and put my seal over it. And so the seal will always be with the document. It's my authorization of the document. It's this sort of the signature on it. But in these letters closed that still existed and were sealed shut, the act of breaking the seal was this moment of delivery that was a way of confirming receipt. That this document was opened, it was read, and that changes the act of verification. That somebody received this, and what you find, and then I lay that next to Japanese culture at this moment, where you see somebody has read your letter. This little line that says read functions, and especially when they actually click on it. So there is this moment for the college students where it pops up as a notification, somebody has messaged you. Do I open it? Because if I open it, that breaks the seal. It's a moment of verification. Somebody has opened this message, and now that act of verification has changed my relationship to response. And what you see basically in every chapter is trying to do some of the media history work and media archaeology work of trying to understand something like medieval seals within their culture and within their infrastructures and their gender dynamics and their particular situation, but to understand that there's a lineage between a seal being broken and a message being opened on a phone, and as an act of verification. And that to understand these as media outside of a longer history is to, in part, create a media history that is more about disruption than continuity. You know, that there are moments of rupture where there is nothing but perhaps like a mobile phone, you know, and a mobile phone has so many historical precedents, you know, so the act of media history, while trying to situate these things within their specific context, is also say, what can we learn about the contemporary moment by setting these two things side by side and understanding them individually, but also in terms of continuity rather than distinction. So the whole book tries to do that. This just being one example.
I was just wondering if you could speak a bit more about what you mentioned earlier about what we lose when we lose waiting time.
Mm-hmm.
You gave one example.
Yeah.
But I'd like to explore a bit more about this positive.
Yeah, great. Yeah. Yeah, one of the things that comes to mind too for me in my own life, trying to encourage myself to wait, is one of these things that cognitive scientists call the default network of the brain. The default network is also called the imagination network and allows you to imagine new things. And the default network of the brain only happens through pauses, through delays, actually, through wait times. You can't. So basically, the default network of the brain comes through daydreaming, or being in a place of perhaps sensory deprivation, like if you're in the shower, you know, these moments where you're like, oh, something clicks, or you're out running, or you're standing in line at the grocery store and something kind of clicks for you. And you're like, oh, I get it. Or often right before you fall asleep, you know, like if you have a notebook next to you, it's fantastic, because the default network of the brain kicks in because you're not searching for an answer. The brain instead finds it through the default network. So there are certain ideas and certain modes of creativity that only come through boredom, through daydreaming, through letting yourself wait and not occupy yourself. And what we're losing is the ability to tap into the default network if we are doing something at all times. So if you're not daydreaming or being bored, you're not letting your brain access that default network. And you're then limiting the potential for you to find some really interesting connections in your research that cannot come by searching for them. You know, so that for me is one of the things that I've been embracing, and just letting myself be bored more often. In terms of health as well, just on, you know, having those moments where you do let yourself do nothing is healthier in terms of your physical body. Otherwise, you know, the pace of being busy all the time and doing something all the time takes a very significant toll on your body as well. So, you know, positioning yourself to be bored a little more often actually is beneficial both for body and research, I think. That's just one example.
Just to say thanks, I have a lot of thoughts on this, but one of the things that I'm part of is affiliated with the university, a project, neuroscience laboratory here called Neuromod. It's a 5-year longitudinal study.
Nice.
And I'm kind of co-leading the language tasks of this. It's a multimedia study, so subjects in MRI and MEG scanners will be, for my part, reading, but we'll have them watching movies and stuff like this. So, so I'm designing the kind of tasks that they'll be experiencing. Yeah. So part of them will be reading, but because of this, I think we'll be incorporating some wait times.
Yeah, nice, exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
So it should be very interesting.
That's great. Yeah, that would be really interesting to see. And even actually, you mentioned it's a longitudinal study. Longitudinal studies in and of themselves are defined by waiting, right? Like you cannot do that mode of research without waiting. There are notions that require time. You know, it's like, okay, we'll study here and now we'll wait, and then we're going to study you in 5 years, you know, and do the comparison, you know. So people who do longitudinal studies, this is your mode of research, you know, this is your method is wait to know, and you cannot get the answers just by that one slice of time, you know.
Yeah, definitely not. I mean, you know, even the different scanners themselves have different sort of efficacies, or that's how they're regarded because of the wait times between the scanning.
Yeah,
So,
interesting. That's so interesting. Great, thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
We have time for one last question.
I'm curious to know if you've documented occurrences when you wait forever. You mentioned destruction.
Yes.
So
when
a letter is never delivered to you, or an email goes into your spam. So
yeah, absolutely.
So what's the status of waiting if it's, if it never
arrives? Yeah, exactly. So I begin the chapter on medieval seals by actually looking at a trove of archives in the British National Archives. It's called the Letters of the High Court of Admiralty. It's this long row of archival boxes of letters that were never delivered. There's about 160,000 of them, that whenever the British Navy would come in and capture an enemy ship, they would take the mailbag on board as evidence. And so you have all of these letters that never arrived, due to war or quarantine and plague or interception. So writing a letter in this period was very much defined by the potential that it never would arrive. So for me, that shapes the very nature of connection. If connection is impossible to verify, how does that shape how you write? How does that shape the very act of writing a love letter? That's like the next project, but I kind of look at it here momentarily. But I think that the indefinite wait times, when that is entering into a exchange, radically shape how we think of space and intimacy and connection. And it also becomes this potential for understanding the kinds of things that we hope for. What interesting, kind of connecting these, your comment and this comment, is that we will always wait, but we are always presented with the possibility of it being eliminated, because that possibility presents us with such promise. So the indefinite wait times actually reveal a lot of the hopes that we have about connection and what it means to connect, of what relationships represent for us, either that be business transactions or intimate transactions. The other pairing with the High Court of Admiralty letters is the Voyager spacecraft that was launched. On it was that gold record of like human history and music and, trying to identify. And it's sent out there, and we don't expect a response, So the interesting thing about us deciding to put a message on a spacecraft that goes out there is not that potentially intelligent life might find it. I think that's the impulse, but actually what it reflects about us, right? The very act of writing a letter that might never arrive says more about us than it says about the act of communication. The very act of inscription is an act of identity, right? So the infinite wait times are more about us and how we practice our identities, how we inscribe them, than it is about reciprocity, I think. So infinite delays are often about who we are and how we interpret. So, and then one last thing is ghosting. When you send a text message and then they just don't ever respond. And the emotional toll of that is that we take that personally, when really the act of that silence and loss is a reflection more on the person not responding than it is about the person who is waiting for the message. So these wait times are often about inscribing who we are and who we hope to be, I think, if they never come to fruition.
Bien, merci beaucoup. Thanks again, Jason, for a wonderful talk today. And I'll mention that our next speaker is Laura Mendel at McGill this time on the Thursday, the 28th of February at 2 o'clock in the Research Commons of the McGill Library. She'll be talking about Big Diva project, growing out of her interest on ARC. And thanks again.
Yes.